So how many of you have ever been to the White House? Anybody? Just one. Okay. So the White House that we have been to, and I've been there twice, including just at the end of August this year, the only thing that is really the same about that building is the white exterior walls. All the interior was demolished in the 1950s under Truman's presidency, and that's what we're going to talk about. So we have to remember that I'm going to tell the story of how the White House basically started to fall in on itself because of a number of decisions that were being made during the years. And the other thing to remember about the White House, in terms of how it was constructed, is you've got the white exterior walls, sandstone walls, that originally went down 5 feet, and then it had an 8-foot spread footing on it. And then attached on the inside of the white sandstone walls was a brick wall. The brick wall rested on no footings at all. So it's on soft clay and sand. And so the structure of the White House as it was originally built was attached to the brick walls, which are attached to the sandstone walls, but it started to sink because there's no foundation, and it started to pull away from the sandstone walls. So we're going to talk about why did that happen, and what did they do about it to fix it. So I think it's probably one of the most significant public construction projects of the 20th century. There's a lot of things that, well, mainly that they did wrong, that didn't work out very well. And so I want to tell the story from a public procurement perspective, and kind of what can we learn from that in doing public jobs today. So this is our quick agenda of what we're going to look at. So the White House was, the location for it was selected in 1791 by George Washington. And the next year, 1792, he laid the cornerstone for it. They actually held a design competition for the White House, and they awarded the design to an Irish-born guy named James Hoban. Actually, one of the people who submitted a design was Thomas Jefferson, but he did it under a pseudonym, so they didn't know it was him, but his design was not accepted. So when the building was actually built, and it took 8 years to build it, from 1792 to 1800, it was built primarily with slave labor. The slaves were the ones who hoisted the white sandstone blocks into place. There was no such thing as prevailing wages back then. Cost $232,372 to build it, which in today's money is about $63 million or so. So on November 1st, 1800, John Adams moves in as the first president to occupy the White House. All presidents except for George Washington have lived there. So Adams moves in, but he only lives there for 4 months because he got defeated in the 1800 election by Thomas Jefferson. So he leaves on March 4th, 1801, when Jefferson is inaugurated. Actually, what John Adams did, he was kind of ticked off that he got beat by Jefferson. So at 4 o'clock in the morning on March 4th, 1801, Adams snuck out of town. He did not attend Jefferson's inauguration. So for 60 years, the White House stood as the largest building in the United States. So the question comes up, when Adams moved into the White House, was the building substantially complete? So when we're dealing with a construction project, we have a definition of substantial completion, and that is, does the owner have beneficial use and occupancy of the facility for its intended purpose? So was the White House substantially complete? Well, let's take a look at some of the information. So the rooms all reeked of beer because they used beer in the wallpaper waste. Only half of the 36 rooms were plastered. They had 39 fireplaces that were blazing away to dry the plaster walls. They only had 1 of 3 staircases that had been finished. There was no glass in some of the windows, only iron bars. Less than half of the rooms were furnished. and some of the rooms were used as storage. So this was a very primitive type of setting that Adams moved into initially. But the question is, was it substantially complete? Could it be used for its intended purpose? So shortly after moving in, John Adams writes to his wife, and he says, the building is in a state to be habitable. So he thought it was substantially complete. So in 1814, the British come to town, War of 1812, and they burn the White House. They also torch the Capitol building. But what happened just before they burned it, Dolly Madison, James Madison's wife, had been there just prior. The president had already left. Dolly had been there. She had set a table for some guests for dinner, and then she was told, the British are coming, you better get out. So she leaves right away, leaves the dinner setting. The British come in, see the setting, they eat the meal. And but then Dolly Madison, before she leaves, she famously has aides cut out the portrait of George Washington painted by Gilbert Stuart, rolled up and taken off to safety. This is a picture of me in late August when I visited the White House in front of that Gilbert Stuart painting of George Washington in the East Room of the White House. So they did a sole source selection to select the architect to rebuild the White House, and who did they select? James Hoban, the guy who had designed the building to begin with. The project was substantially complete in 1817, and President James Monroe moved in that year. So there have been a number of things that have happened during the White House over the years. One is in 1891, they installed electricity. I want to show you a quick video clip that my son and I produced. This is it's on my website, and it envisions what would a modern day newscaster think about and how would they report on key events in presidential history. So in this case, the installation of electricity in the White House in 1891. So we'll see if the technology cooperates here.
President Benjamin Harrison has made a major technological improvement to the 90-year-old executive mansion in Washington, but he's forcing his staff to operate the new technology and won't get near it himself.
September 28, 1891. From the World News headquarters of PresidentialHistory.com. This is Presidential History News with Mike Purdy.
Good morning and welcome to Presidential History News. I'm Mike Purdy. For the last 4 months, workers have descended upon the President's house in Washington to install electric lights and wiring. To avoid unsightly surface-mounted wires, the workers have gouged out conduits in the plaster walls of the historic building and then plastered them over. Electric lights have been around for just about 10 years. Famed inventor Thomas Edison developed the revolutionary incandescent bulb in early 1880. But the technology is still unreliable and somewhat crude, which is why President Harrison has decided to retain the gas lights in addition to the new electric ones. Although the president saw fit to get a jump start on the 20th century with this new technology, he remains deeply suspicious of it. It has been reported that the president is deathly afraid of being shocked or even electrocuted. Neither the president nor any members of his family have put their hand to a light switch since they've been installed. As a result, Lights in the president's second floor residence sometimes remain burning throughout the night. Harrison has left the risky task of turning lights on and off to his staff, reasoning that it would be far better for one of them to receive the shock of electrical current than the President of the United States himself. We'll have to wait and see if the President becomes more familiar with this new technology, which shows signs of being used more widely every year. For Presidential History News, I'm Mike Hurd.
So in 1902, Theodore Roosevelt does some major renovations of the White House. He notices a number of the floors are sagging. So he has steel beams installed to support it, and they're anchored into what? The brick walls that have no foundation. So this is adding further weight to it. And Roosevelt, of course, wanted the job done quickly. 1920s, Calvin Coolidge was president, and there was a leaking roof, and so he ended up building a third floor addition, and that added more weight, steel, concrete blocks to the already fragile building on both the outside masonry walls as well as the interior brick walls. Fast forward for a minute to 1945. Harry Truman has become president in April 1945 upon Franklin Roosevelt's death. And Truman is in the White House in the summer of 1945. His wife, Bess, is back in Independence, Missouri. She doesn't like being First Lady. She doesn't like Washington, D.C. And so Truman writes to her. He says, "I sit here in this old house and work on foreign affairs, read reports, and work on speeches, all the while listening to the ghosts walk up and down the hallway, and even right here in the study. The floors pop, and the drapes move back and forth." Ghosts in the White House. 2 years later, Truman is still writing about the ghosts in the White House. He says, again writing to his wife in summer 1947, "The ghost walked and walked last night. I left all the doors open. That gave me a chance to hear all the pops and creaks in your room." And then a month later, he writes to his daughter, "The ghost continued to walk up and down the hall and around the study." So what were these ghosts? Well, it was the White House starting to fall in upon itself. So there were a number of problems from a structural perspective. Some of the beams and joists in the White House had been cut into, even if they were load-bearing walls, because presidents, as they made modifications through the years, they said do things quickly. There weren't good design standards or even construction standards, so there's multiple notches there. You've got old and brittle beams, some of which were from the 1814 fire. They had not been replaced. They were charred, but they had not been replaced. You've got lots of plumbing that's been added during the years and then abandoned and new plumbing put in, so that adds additional weight. So what's happening all the time, this additional weight is being added, is pulling down on these foundations, these brick walls, which have no foundation. It's pulling down, they're sinking into the clay and the sand, and it's pulling it away from the white sandstone walls. Truman's added 3 pianos to the second floor family residence. That added thousands of pounds of weight as well. And there were lots of ceiling, plaster cracks, wall cracks, and so it caused them to have to do some bracing. But then one time during Truman's presidency, there was a reception being held in the Blue Room, and there's a 1,200-pound chandelier hanging over the center of the Blue Room. So you've got all these little old ladies from the Daughters of the American Revolution at this tea, and they're all talking and everything, and then suddenly they all stop talking because they look up and this chandelier is starting to sway back and forth, and it's tinkling, making noises. So it had been screwed into wooden beams that had been hanging there for 48 years, and that beam actually was from the 1817 rebuild of the White House. So it's dry, it's brittle, it's cracked, and that's what this chandelier is on. Fortunately, it did not fall down, but it could just as easily have. Bess Truman, who was actually at the reception, said, "I was afraid the chandelier was going to come right down on top of all those people." The president himself said, "You better get some engineers in here. They might have to shore up the floors." So basically the second floor, there was a report that was done, a very quick report done in January 1948, which said that the second floor needed some work. It needed to be shored up. Second floor, of course, is where the president's family lived, and it was about to collapse onto the state dining room floor. Truman's quote himself about the movement of the White House floors, he says it sagged and moved like a ship at sea. So this was not a stable type of environment to be in. So they shored it up with some steel beams, some collars around some exposed beams to do that. The superintendent of buildings, who was ultimately responsible for the White House, had this comment. He said, "I can only believe that the beams are staying up there from force of habit only." So February, a month later, February 25th, they have a preliminary structural survey done of the White House to kind of delve into it a little bit more. And they picked some consultants to do it. They had no consultant selection process to pick them. The president himself simply picked the leaders of the National Architects Group and the National Engineering Group to be the ones to do the study. And their conclusion was that the second floor should be reconstructed at the earliest practicable date. And then they also said that due to the fire risk, that they should cut down on usage of electricity. And they also said there needs to be a much more detailed structural survey done of the building. So kind of as a side note, but it is an important story as well, is the balcony that President Truman ended up having installed in 1947 and 1948 while the White House is, rocking like a ship. And so you see the picture on the left. This is the south portico of the White House, and you don't see any balcony here. And here you see a balcony which Truman had installed, even to this day is called the Truman Balcony. So how did this story come about? Well, Truman said that this old barn called the White House should be arranged for the president so he could live like other people. Right, I'm sure the president lives like other people in the White House, but that's what his comment was. So why did he want to build the balcony? Well, there are a number of reasons why. One is just from an aesthetic perspective, it would have a great view. You could sit out on the balcony, you could see the Washington Monument. It'd be nice, you wouldn't have hopefully crowds of people seeing you there, you could have some privacy. Secondly, from an architectural perspective, here it is, the owner, President Truman, saying, architecturally, it's just more correct to have the balcony up there. Another major reason is he was trying to keep his wife in town during the summers. So he thought if he created this amenity for her that she would stick around and they'd have more time together. Well, that didn't work actually. But that was another one of his motivations. Another motivation was he was having a squabble with Congress. Congress had voted $1.6 million to do some major expansion of the west wing of the White House. But when the design of the project became publicly known, Congress was aghast at it and they pulled the money back. That ticked Truman off. And so he decided, well, he could work with money that he had in his own budget and he could control things. He said, I'm going to preserve the general architectural scheme of the White House any damn way I want to. So you need an architect to design this balcony on the south portico. So no competitive selection process to select an architect. Instead, what Truman does is he goes to a guy named William Delano. who sits on the Fine Arts Commission, who's going to have to approve the balcony addition, and he hopes that that would help get approval. They start the design process in 1947, and construction is in the first quarter of 1948. So going back to, the balcony addition actually adds 62 tons of weight to the building, which is a problem. They take these steel beams and they sink them into the masonry walls, the sandstone walls. The architect, Mr. Delano, delegates all the engineering details to the in-house White House architect, not an engineer. And so that was an issue. From a cost perspective, Truman said, hey, I've got $10,000 in my budget, build it for $10,000. It ultimately ends up costing about $16,000. So it's a very political project. So what really got the president's attention was in June 1948, when the president's daughter, Margaret, was playing on her Steinway piano in her sitting room on the second floor, when all of a sudden, one of the piano legs went through the rotted floor below her into the ceiling on the first floor. And so he kind of thought, well, maybe something's wrong with this building. Maybe it's not just ghosts. Maybe it really is falling apart. And so the beam in Margaret's room was actually completely split. So in June 1948, Congress ends up authorizing a $50,000 to do a more comprehensive structural survey of the White House. Again, from a selection process, who's going to do this structural analysis? No selection process. The president picked the people, including an architect he had worked with in Missouri, the people who had been on the February survey of it, and the public building superintendent. So no public process for this highly political job. The assistant usher of the White House, he said that the floors sagged and sloped like a roller coaster. So if you were walking on the second floor of the White House, you would feel it, okay? So as they did their structural survey, they found a number of problems. One is that they were hampered by the fact there were no as-built drawings from all of the changes that have been done to the White House over the many years. And so they were doing their investigations blindly, essentially. They did investigations, they tore off plaster, they drilled holes, they pried up baseboards and flooring, they chipped away at stucco over exterior brick walls, and they're looking for the source of the cracks, and they're trying to figure this out. They're finding thousands of pounds of abandoned pipe that are adding to the weight and pushing down the White House into the soft clay and sand. The family dining room, which was below Margaret Truman's room, they found had dropped 18 inches. That's a lot, okay? So this is coming down on them. They found the walls that had cuts through load-bearing beams. They also found beams that were charred from the 1814 fire that had been kept in place during the 1817 renovation of the White House, or rebuild of the White House. Hadn't been replaced either in 1817 or 1902. We talked about the fact that the exterior sandstone walls originally went down only 5 feet, and there was an 8-foot spread footing underneath there, but that the interior brick walls had no footing. They're on soft clay and sand. And so the brick walls are starting to pull away and separate from the outside sandstone walls as more weight is added and as they're making some unwise decisions about what beams to cut into. They also found there was a significant fire risk. They opened up some walls. They found uninsulated electrical wires right next to wood shavings. So there's a huge fire risk to the building. And they said it's not just the second floor of the White House that is at risk, it's the entire building. So what did they do? Well, they installed some steel pipes, wooden braces on the east side. More plaster is falling down. There's a new 12-foot long crack that's developing. So this is all 1948. So what's going on in 1948? So Truman is running for re-election. And Truman kept the news of the White House falling down from the public because he was afraid that if that word got out, that people would say, well, not only is the White House falling down, but the Truman presidency is falling apart, and he was afraid he was not going to get reelected. And he was significantly down in the polls, of course. One of the pollsters in September 1948 said, I'm going to stop the polling because it's obvious that Thomas Dewey is going to win. There's no need to do any more polling. So even though it's a very risky environment, the president continues to live there. November 2nd, 1948, upset victory. Despite all the polls, Truman defeats Thomas Dewey. Truman then goes back to the White House immediately after the election. He's been in Missouri, and 5 days after the election, his staff tell him he has to move out of the White House. It's too dangerous. So this becomes public information at that point, and it was announced that the White House was closing indefinitely. So what's going to happen to the White House? So Congress debated the options about what to do. They thought, well, we could gut the building totally and then just build a new home for the president. Or maybe take the White House, turn it into a museum, and build a new home for the president someplace else. So they punted on this decision, pretty significant decision. They created a commission for the renovation of the executive mansion, and they delegated to the commission the decision on what to do with the White House. They appropriated $5.4 million before they even knew what was going to happen, what the program was for dealing with the White House. So the commission debated three options. One was to gut and rebuild the White House, so to basically dismantle the outside walls, gut the interior, build a new steel infrastructure, and put the exterior walls back in place at the end. That was one option. Second option was to demolish the interior and exterior and just build a replica of the White House, not save anything from the original. And the third option, which they ended up going with, and the president was pretty adamant about this as well, is to keep the outer walls in place, gut the interior totally, and build a new steel infrastructure inside, preserving the exterior white sandstone walls. So a quick recap on what the schedule looked like. So 1945, Truman, finds out about the ghosts in the White House. There's a couple preliminary reports in the early part of 1948. The more Margaret's piano light goes through the floor in June. There's a more comprehensive report in June. Election Day, the White House closes shortly after Election Day. And then 1949 is decision-making and design, and most drawings were done by September 1949. Truman and his family, of course, move across the street to the Blair House, which has less than ideal security, and there was an attempted assassination of the president at Blair House when a couple of police officers died in that shooting. Truman was at the Blair House at the time of the shooting. He heard the commotion, poked his head out the window to see what was going on, at which point some of the security officers said, "Get back in," which he did. So what is the scope of work for a construction project like this? These are some of the factors. We're going to talk about each of these in turn. So the scope of work is basically taking an interior project, deconstructing it, removing everything, storing and keeping items that are of historical value, and demolishing a lot of things. There's a lot of excavation because they want to dig down deeper. So it's basically constructing a new building within an 85-foot by 165-foot shell of a fragile historic sandstone structure, and put in new electrical, new plumbing, new concrete, everything. So here's a picture of what it looked like when they were rebuilding it. You can see the steel infrastructure beginning to go into place there, and all that remains is the exterior sandstone walls and That's all that's left. Here's a picture with some of the construction equipment there, which Truman refused to give permission to cut larger holes so they could get the equipment in, so they had to disassemble some of the equipment and then reassemble it in here and do the work and then disassemble it and take it out. So the idea was to reconstruct this building so that it would look and feel like the existing White House. They decided to take the exterior walls down from 5 feet down to 20 feet to make it more stable, and the contractor would be required to furnish all labor, equipment, supplies, and materials to do the project. So how do you get a contractor to do a very historically significant project like this who knows what they're doing? So we face that sometimes when we're doing public construction projects. They decided to go through a pre-qualification process. It was not particularly well documented. It appears to be somewhat arbitrary in how they did it, but they required contractors to fill out a questionnaire and said they had to have special qualifications and experience. So we have that tool sometimes available to us for public agencies, either using pre-qualification or use of bidder responsibility criteria to get a qualified contractor. The contract type that they settled on is a fairly risky type. It's since been outlawed by the federal government, and I don't think state and local governments use it very much, but it is called a cost plus fixed fee contract. And basically the contractor bids on just a fixed fee. So they're bidding just the cost of their overhead and profit. And then the owner agrees to pay the contractor on a time and materials basis. So in other words, whatever it costs the contractor to construct the project is what they'll pay the contractor. Now, that's kind of a risky type of project. It's risky to manage a budget to that because the contractor might not be efficient. They might slow things down, try to make this a full employment program for a longer period of time. So it's difficult to manage costs on a project like that. So they pre-qualified 15 contractors. There were 15 bids that were submitted. The low bid was from John McShane Incorporated at $100,000. So that's their fixed fee, their overhead and profit. Most bids were in the $250,000 range, and the high bid was close to $1 million. They awarded the project in just 8 days after they opened bids. That's a very fast turnaround time. So the question is John McShane really qualified to do the project, and could he do it at $100,000? Well, he was a very competent contractor. He was known as the man who built Washington. He built the Jefferson Memorial, the Pentagon, the Bureau of Printing and Engraving, FDR's library, a number of other facilities, and he was a great cost estimator. They said he could estimate a project down to the last nail, and he made estimating into a fine art. But why did he bid so low? I mean, the high bid is close to $1 million. He bids $100,000. He said, well, I figured no one would go as low as that, so I bid it. Well, he got the job. And he also said that, look, we'll be lucky if we come out even on it, but I wouldn't give up that job for any money you could name. So he wanted to add to his credentials the fact that his company had rebuilt the White House. So one of the issues that we face when we're managing public construction projects is, what is the organizational structure? What's the construction management, project management structure? So one of the problems with this particular project is there are basically too many cooks in the kitchen. Too many people with decision-making authority. At the highest level, you had the Commission for the Renovation of the Executive Mansion, who was ultimately responsible. They hired a project manager and assistant project manager to deal with the day-to-day issues. And you also had the architect, the White House architect. It's kind of a one-man show. He had a couple of staff with him. And so they're involved with it. And then you've got the president himself, who's very, very involved with the project. Every morning he would go out and inspect it. He would give direction to the contractors about what to do and what not to do. He reviewed drawings and approved drawings. So this isn't normal for an owner at that level to be that intimately involved, but Truman was. You've got the contractor who's involved as part of the team. You've got subcontractors. You have Congress as the funding source. You have the Public Buildings Department, who also has responsibility. There's the Fine Arts Commission, who has to look at aesthetic issues. And then finally, there's the media. The media is always kind of a player in managing public projects. So this is a pretty high security risk project. You've got 300 construction workers that are just feet away from the Oval Office. And so the Secret Service fingerprinted all of them and screened them. Every day when they checked in, they'd have to show their badge, they'd have to turn their badge in, they'd pick up their badge at the end of the day. So what do you do with all of the furniture and all of the materials that come out of the White House? Somebody has to manage this. So they selected a firm to manage it without any competitive bid process. It was a gentleman's agreement between the White House and a firm called B. Altman. They agreed to do it for $85 a month with no profit. And they stored these materials in New York City in climate-controlled facilities. Now, Altman figured if they could get their foot in the door there, they would have a chance to be able to get the contract to do the interior design and decoration of the White House, and they were absolutely correct. They got that contract with no competition. The justification was that it was in the interest of the United States. That was their sole source justification. And again, he offered to do that at no profit. But there was only $212,000 to decorate 66 rooms, and they had already spent $232,000 on temporary construction shacks. So because of budget shortfalls on the project, much of the material that came out of the White House and that was stored did not go back into the White House. It was simply too expensive to do it, and so a lot of it ended up in garbage dumps. The curator of the White House in 1973, talking about the renovation of the White House in the 1950s, said it was one of the greatest disasters in White House history. Their surplus program was also mismanaged. So there were also cost overruns on the project. One of the things that happened, of course, is they developed the budget. Congress gave them $5.4 million before they knew what they were going to do. So obviously there are going to be some cost problems. Congress did appropriate some additional money in August 1951. They gave $261,000 more. Ultimately, it cost about $6 million, which is about $60 million in today's money. So why were there cost overruns beside the fact that the project wasn't estimated appropriately? Well, there were, this was during the Korean War, so there's material shortages and prices are increasing because of that. The marble that was being used in the White House was very expensive, and so that was jacking up prices, and they had to cut other corners to be able to put that marble in. The White House architect insisted on the best quality of materials. That jacked up some prices as well. They had a small $1 million change order to add a bomb shelter. That jacked up the cost as well, and work stopped while they finalized the plans to that. So how did they deal with this budget shortfall? Well, one, they did value engineering. So looking at are there cheaper ways, are there cheaper materials to do the same function to still get what we want out of the project. So they substituted cheaper materials, cheaper processes. The contractor ultimately ended up paying $30,000 of his own money to complete the project, and he lost a total of about $200,000 on the job. So when we look at the schedule, they're given the notice to proceed in mid-December 1949. They're given 660 calendar days to do the work, meaning it should have been done by October 1951. The contractor promises completion by the end of 1951, and then he says, oh, it's actually going to go beyond that even. Truman was getting pretty frustrated living in the Blair House and with the slowness of the project, and so he issues an ultimatum in late January, and he says the project will be done by April 1st. It's a date that he ultimately moved up by 6 additional days. The contractor, John McShane himself, at this point stepped in. and he started managing the project. It makes you wonder what his project manager and superintendent were really doing, but McShane stepped in. He established schedules for subcontractor deadlines, and so the project was eventually substantially completed on March 27th, 1952, 76 days late. So other reasons why there was schedule delays, so they had trouble getting these structural beams into the White House because you've got to keep the walls there. The commission that was appointed to manage the project, they spent 2 months making a decision. What should we do with the walls of the East Room? Should we paint them, or should we leave the dark brown varnish on the wall paneling? That delays the project. There was the marble that the government was getting for the project. The quarry there flooded, and it had to be drained. So that caused an additional delay. The White House architect, Winslow, rejected some shipments because it wasn't up to his quality standards. So there's other design issues that come up. One is that there was a slow production of the design drawing, so he couldn't produce these fast enough. Winslow couldn't, the White House architect. He had a small staff. The shop drawing approval process was delayed because there was a bottleneck between Winslow and the public buildings superintendent. Every time they did value engineering, every time they decided to substitute a material or a process or a design, they had to redo the plans. So that takes additional time. There was a shortage of riveters to rivet the steel beams in place. So that causes the schedule to slip some there. The flooring contractor went missing in the summer of 1951, kind of disappeared for a while. He wasn't staffing the project adequately. He had bid the project way too low. They caught him putting down green lumber on the floor, and so they made him tear that up and put in appropriate lumber. The plasterers in August 1951 went on strike for higher wages. So there's lots of schedule delays. This is a project that was moving very, very fast, and so there were also quality problems that came up. There were 2 fireplaces that were installed in the wrong direction. The presidential seal in Cross Hall is that hallway that connects the East Room with the state dining room. The presidential seal had the eagle's head facing in the wrong direction. There's all this marble that's being installed, so it turned the White House into kind of an echo chamber. There's backdrafts of fireplace flues, made some of the rooms uninhabitable. Pantry sinks were too small for some of the dinner dishes. The cabinets were too high for anybody to reach, and there's no electricity in the sewing room. One reporter said that the building had an institutional feel to it after completion, not the warm feel of the White House. He said it was as if someone had decided to set up a modern office in a deserted castle. Well, that's what they did. It's a modern office, steel infrastructure inside this castle-like building. So the day after President Truman moves in, he moves back in on March 27th, the day after, he writes the following. He says, "With all the trouble and worry, it's worth it, but not $5.5 million. If I could have been in charge of the construction, it would have been done in half the money, for half the money, and in half the time." I don't know if he could have really done that, but again, part of the big problem was too many cooks in the kitchen. So he might have helped some on that. So what can we learn from this? One is we need to have clear programmatic objectives for our construction projects. Early on, we have to figure out what the appropriate project delivery method is, whether it's low bid, whether it's design build, whether it's construction manager at risk or some other model. And so we have to think about that and how we're going to pay the contractor. We've got to get political buy-in early on from a programmatic perspective from elected officials. And if we have a historic building we're doing, there's a lot more work and planning that has to go into that. We have to have a realistic budget and cost estimate that is done after we establish what the program is going to be. And we have to have a realistic number of days to actually complete the work. The design should be completed before bidding occurs. Again, these are all things that they didn't do on the White House reconstruction. They've got to have sufficient architectural and design staff, whether that's internal and or external. There needs to be a clear definition of who is in charge of the project. What is the level of hierarchy between the owner, the contractor, the architect or engineer, who's clearly involved so that we don't have too many decision makers in the process. We have to hold people accountable so the project and construction managers actually manage the project and do their work. Maybe we want to select a contractor by having a pre-qualification process or use of bidder responsibility criteria where we look at the low bidder to make sure that they meet certain criteria. And then we have to ensure that subcontractors are appropriately managed. So here's the north face of the White House today. You can see some statistics about the building. It is a large building. There's a great book out there called The Hidden White House by a guy named Robert Clara, who tells the story of this reconstruction of the White House in the 1950s. What Clara does is amazing because he does tell it as a story, even though practically every sentence is packed with details. You don't feel like those details are, a problem. You feel like those details just add life to the project. It's a wonderful read. If you're interested in the subject, I highly recommend you take a look at that. That is all that I had to say about the White House reconstruction, the 1950s. What we can learn from it is a fascinating story. If you've got any questions, I'd be glad to try to answer those now.
You said that they had problems with the marble. I've never been in the White House. Is it marble like on all the floors? Or?
Yeah. So I haven't been on all the floors. I haven't been on the second floor, the family area. But yes, it's so you go in Cross Hall in the main entryways, in the entryway, in the basement level. Yeah, there's marble all around. I did not notice the echo chamber effect. So they may have done some things since then to kind of deal with that, or it could have been just that one reporter's comment.
Has there been any other reconstruction since the 50s?
Yes, there's been other work done on the White House since the 1950s. Nothing as major as this. Some of it is kind of shrouded in mystery. A couple of years ago, there was some significant digging going on the White House lawn, and people are speculating that it was some kind of a new bomb-proof type shelter, but no details really came out about that, so I know that occurred. That's all that I'm aware of that's occurred. Yeah. Yes?
So there was that $1 million change order for the bomb shelter. Is there any pictures? Does anybody know what that $1 million bomb shelter looks like?
Do we know what the $1 million bomb shelter looks like? No, we don't. So just like the more recent construction that we're speculating was another bomb-proof shelter, I have not ever seen pictures of that. And maybe they exist, but I suspect from this.
Back then, what they were spending around $6 million. 1/6 of that was spent on a bomb shelter.
Right.
That's going to be a pretty extensive.
It's pretty extensive. I mean, I suspect from a security perspective, they do not want these details released. Interestingly, when I was at the White House late August for a conference, which included 2 different days. I was there. One was a tour of the White House, kind of the public tour, and then a couple of days later, there was a reception that the President and First Lady held for the conference attendees. And the President was there in the East Room and made some remarks. And at the conclusion of his remarks, he said that he was going to open up the Oval Office to all the attendees to walk through. I later talked to a security guard about it. He said in 3 years he's been in the White House, he's never seen it opened up for such a large group. But the interesting thing from a security perspective, as I'm walking down the west wing to go to the Oval Office, there's this table set up in the middle of the hallway. And on the table is filled with cell phones. And Secret Service are there and say, no cameras in the White House. Leave your phone here. Here's a little post-it, put your name on it. And so no cameras. So from a security perspective, I think they're pretty careful on that kind of thing. So. Well, thank you all very much. Let me know if you have further questions.